April 1943. The air was cold enough to bite through wool, and the morning fog hung low over the ruined valley. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder over broken fields, and somewhere beyond the smoke, a line of tanks crawled through mud-black silhouettes against the pale horizon. In the remnants of a mechanic's depot, a man stood alone, staring at what was left of a once proud workshop. The roof had collapsed months ago. Rain dripped from jagged beams, landing on rusted tools and scorched metal. His name was Anton Kessler, a field mechanic in what was left of the 17th Battalion. His uniform was torn, his hands blackened with oil and frost, and his breath came out in clouds that vanished almost instantly. Around him lay the bones of war-shattered engines, twisted tank hulls, burnt-out trucks. The smell was heavy, a mix of diesel, mud, and something older. The scent of despair. Every morning he came back to this place, not because anyone told him to, but because it was all he knew. Fixing things was what he did before the world caught fire. He bent down to pick up a broken gear, its teeth chipped, edges blackened. Once he would have tossed it aside without thought. Now he turned it in his hands like something sacred. Every part mattered. Every scrap of steel was a possibility. The radio crackled in the corner, spitting out static and half words. Retreat to sector, then silence. Another order lost in the storm. The front was collapsing. Supplies were gone, the men were exhausted, and Anton had been given an impossible command: get something moving, anything. He'd laughed when they said it, a hollow laugh, dry as dust. They wanted him to bring machines back from the dead, to turn corpses of metal into living beasts again. He had no engines, no spare armor, not even proper welding rods. Just piles of junk and a heart that refused to stop. The day before, he'd tried to repair a burn, doubt half-track. The moment he started the engine, the thing coughed once, then exploded into smoke. One of the young soldiers watching burst into laughter, not out of joy, but madness. Another kicked the side of the wreck, shouting, "It's useless." Anton said nothing. He simply watched the smoke rise, his mind already somewhere else. That night, as shells rumbled far away, he sat on the ground beside the wreckage. A single candle burned in the mud between his boots. He took out his small notebook, pages smeared with grease, and began to draw. His pencil scratched quietly under the roar of war-rough lines, impossible angles, the ghost of a machine that didn't exist yet. He wasn't sure what he was drawing. A truck, a tank, some strange hybrid. But something inside him refused to stop moving. He remembered his father's words, spoken years ago in a small garage outside Dresden. "Machines are honest, Anton. They only fail when the men who build them lose heart." Now, surrounded by ruin, those words felt like a curse and a promise. At dawn, the frost bit deeper. His breath fogged the cracked glass of the command post where the last officers huddled around a map. They barely noticed Anton enter. He stood at attention, his boots dripping mud onto the floor. "Sir," he said quietly, holding up his notebook, "I think I can build something." The officer looked up gaunt, eyes red from sleepless nights. Out of what? Dreams. Anton hesitated. Out of what's left? A long silence followed. Someone chuckled bitterly. "We don't need dreams, Kessler. We need miracles." He didn't answer, just nodded, turned, and walked back into the cold. The workshop became his world. Days blurred into nights, nights into grey mornings. Rain seeped through the broken roof, dripping onto his drawings. He scavenged through wreckage with bare hands, pulling off panels, unbolting axles, salvaging pieces that still remembered motion. Every clang of metal echoed through the empty depot. Each sound was defiance, the heartbeat of a man refusing to surrender. Sometimes soldiers would wander by, watching in disbelief. "You're wasting your time, old man," one said. Anton didn't even look up. "I don't have time to waste," he murmured. They left him alone after that. The machine he imagined grew in fragments, an engine from a truck, treads from a wrecked panzer, armor plates cut from farm equipment. It made no sense, not yet, but somewhere beneath the rust he could hear it, a rhythm, a pulse. He found an old welder in the corner, its hose cracked, its fuel half gone. When he pressed the trigger, a weak flame sputtered to life. He smiled faintly. "You're still breathing," he whispered. Each night when the others slept, he lit that torch and worked until his hands trembled. Sparks leapt into the darkness, tiny stars that died before reaching the ceiling. The air filled with the smell of scorched iron. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging like salt. He thought about the men at the front, about how they waited, hopeless, cold, counting down days until they'd run out of everything. He wasn't a soldier, he didn't know how to kill, but he could build, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. By the third week, exhaustion had turned to obsession. His fingernails were black with grease, his uniform stiff with soot. He'd stopped shaving, he'd stopped talking. Only the work remained. One night, as rain hammered the tin roof, the power went out. The darkness was absolute. He fumbled for the torch, but it sputtered and died. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks' doubt. He sat in silence, surrounded by the invisible shapes of his half-built dream. The storm outside roared. In the distance, artillery flared, painting the clouds in flashes of red. He thought of leaving, of walking away and letting it all rot with the rest of the world. But then he heard it, a low hum, a whisper of metal shifting as the wind moved through the broken beams. It almost sounded alive. He stood, eyes adjusting to the faint light leaking through a hole in the roof. He could see the outline of his creation, skeletal, unfinished, ugly, yet something about it. Breathed. He walked closer, placed his hand on the cold steel. "You're not ready," he said softly, "but neither am I." He closed his eyes and let his palm rest against the rough surface. It was still, silent, waiting. When dawn came, the fog was thick again. He found himself outside, dragging an old axle through the mud. The weight tore at his arms, but he didn't stop. His boots sank deep, each step a struggle, each breath a cloud of steam. The sound of artillery was closer now, too close, but he didn't lift his head. He had no time for fear. Behind him, a young soldier called out, "Why do you keep working? It's over." Anton paused, breathless. Then he turned and looked at the boy, barely 17, face pale with exhaustion. "Because it's not," Anton said. "Not while we can still build something." The boy didn't answer. He just stared, confused, then slowly walked away. Anton watched him go, then bent back to his work. Somewhere inside, he felt something return, something small but fierce. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, the fog deepened until the world disappeared. Only the faint orange glow of Anton's torch cut through the dark. The rain had stopped. The silence was complete, save for the crackle of fire and the hiss of metal cooling. His hands moved without thought, cutting, welding, shaping. Each piece found its place, almost by instinct. The machine began to take form, its silhouette monstrous, uneven, and alive. Outside, lightning split the sky. For a moment the whole world flashed white, and in that light Anton saw it. The impossible was beginning. He leaned back, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his face. His creation stood before him, half-born, half-dreamed, a creature of war and will. He whispered to it, almost afraid of his own voice, "We'll finish this, you and I." Then he smiled, just barely, the first smile in months. He didn't know it yet, but the idea he had drawn in Greece and ash that night would change everything. The days that followed blurred together in smoke and steel. Anton no longer counted them. The calendar on the wall was blackened by soot, its dates meaningless. Only the rhythm of the work mattered, the rasp of the file, the hiss of the torch, the hammer striking iron until the sound felt like his own heartbeat. Every morning began in silence. No greetings, no orders, no laughter from the camp any more. Just the faint wind that slipped through the cracks of the shattered windows. He worked through it all, through hunger, through cold, through the thunder of war that crept closer with every sunrise. By the fifth morning, the men had begun to leave, units retreating west. Supply trucks vanished, radio lines dead. Anton stayed. He told himself he was finishing one last repair, but he knew that wasn't true. He couldn't walk away from what had begun in that wrecked workshop. Something inside him, stubborn, maybe even mad, refused to stop. He scavenged deeper into the junkyard, finding forgotten relics buried in the mud. The hull of a tractor, the remnants of an armored car, the frame of a burnt-out tank turret. None of it should have fit together, but when he looked at them he didn't see ruin, he saw possibility. Every bolt he turned, every plate he welded, was an act of defiance, a small rebellion against the collapse that surrounded him. One night, as the wind howled through the valley, Anton dragged a gearbox across the floor. It was heavy enough to crush him if it slipped, but he wrestled it into place, his breath coming in sharp bursts. When it finally locked into position, he slumped against it, exhausted, staring up at the dark ceiling. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, something shifted, a new sound, faint but unmistakable, the click of gears aligning. For the first time in weeks, something in his creation had moved. Anton froze, then slowly he turned the crank again. The gears rolled once more, grinding, coughing, but alive. He laughed quietly, a sound strange in the emptiness. "You're waking up," he whispered. He leaned back on his knees, eyes glinting in the flicker of the torchlight. In that instant, the world outside the falling front, the screaming shells, the dying orders, all of it vanished. There was only this, a broken man and a half-built machine daring to live again. By the next dawn, the rumors had begun. They said the mechanic had gone mad, that he was building a monster from scrap metal and lost souls, that he talked to it when no one was around. Maybe they were right. But one of the younger soldiers, the same boy who had once mocked him, began helping. His name was Emil, barely old enough to shave, too young to understand why the world was ending. Yet when he saw Anton at work, something in him stirred. At first he only handed tools, fetched fuel, or wiped soot from the old man's face when the smoke got too thick. But soon he was working beside him, shoulder to shoulder, their breath steaming in the cold air. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The rhythm of work became its own language. Sometimes at night, when the thunder of artillery shook the walls, Emil would whisper, "Do you think it will work?" Anton never looked up. It has to. As the machine grew, so did its presence. The shape began to fill the depot, a crude outline of armor plates bolted over a skeleton of salvaged steel. The treads were uneven, the joints awkward, but it was strong. Brutally strong. Anton had found an old diesel engine from a cargo truck. It was cracked, leaking oil, but when he turned it over, it coughed like an old beast remembering how to breathe. He tore it apart and rebuilt it, piece by piece, until the smell of fuel soaked the walls. For the turret, he scavenged the frame of a rusted tank gun, mounting it with a makeshift swivel from farm machinery. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even safe, but it was all he had. Each night when the work was done, he sat beside it, staring at the patchwork of metal and bolts that now filled the room. He thought of the men who would never see it finished. He thought of the faces that had vanished, the friends buried beneath frozen earth. And he thought of what this machine might mean, not as a weapon, but as proof that even at the edge of collapse, creation was still possible. The following evening, a new sound broke through the fog, engines, far off but approaching. Anton froze. Then came the unmistakable rhythm of tank treads crushing the frozen ground. Enemy patrols. He doused the torch and listened. The noise grew louder, echoing through the valley. He could feel it in his chest, each vibration crawling under his skin. Emil looked at him. Why? Died. What do we do? Anton whispered. We finish. They worked through the night. Every blow of the hammer muffled under the roar of distant engines. Sweat mixed with ash. Time dissolved. When the sun rose, the world outside was silent again, only smoke drifting over the horizon. But inside the workshop, something had changed. The machine stood almost complete. The crude armor gleamed faintly in the dawn. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't elegant, but it was real. Anton ran his hand along its side. The metal was still warm. You're ready to try, he said softly. He climbed inside, cramped between rough steel and exposed wiring. The air smelled of oil and burned rubber. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the ignition. Please, he murmured. The first attempt failed. A cough, a spark, silence. The second, nothing. The third, a shudder, then a deep growl. The engine came alive with a roar that shook the floor. Emil jumped back, eyes wide. The whole machine vibrated, rattling bolts loose, but it held. Anton laughed not in triumph, but disbelief. He slapped the side of the frame, shouting over the noise, "It works." The sound filled the valley, echoing off ruined walls, startling crows into flight. For one fleeting moment, hope was louder than war. But hope comes at a price. Moments later, smoke began to pour from the vents. Flames licked at the edges of the engine. Anton grabbed a rag, beating them down, coughing through the fumes. Emil ran to fetch water, shouting his name. The engine sputtered and died. Silence fell again, thick, choking, final. Anton sank to the floor, eyes stinging from the smoke. His body trembled, but he wasn't angry. He just sat there, staring at the stillness. Emil placed a hand on his shoulder. It almost worked. He said quietly. Anton nodded, almost. Then he looked up at the half. Burned engine, the melted cables, the blackened floor, and he smiled faintly. That means it can, he stood, voice steady now. We'll rebuild. That night he didn't sleep. He rebuilt the coupling, rewired the starter, and cleaned the fuel lines until his fingers bled. Emil dozed off in the corner, curled under a torn blanket, while Anton kept working. Outside, snow began to fall, thick, silent flakes that drifted through the broken roof and melted on the hot metal. The flakes hissed as they vanished, one by one. Anton looked up through the opening, eyes tracing the falling snow against the dark sky. It reminded him of ash, of things burning and fading. He whispered to himself, "Even ashes can build something new." By dawn, the machine was ready again. He turned the key. The engine hesitated, then caught. No fire this time, no smoke, just a deep, steady rumble that filled the space like a heartbeat. Emil woke, eyes wide, and ran to the controls. "It's alive," he breathed. Anton nodded slowly. His face was pale, streaked with soot and exhaustion, but there was light in his eyes now, something fierce, something unbroken. He didn't speak. He just reached for the throttle, easing it forward. The treads jerked once, then rolled slow, uneven but moving. The whole structure lurched across the floor, rattling the walls. It was ungainly, loud, imperfect, but it moved. Anton exhaled, a sound somewhere between laughter and a sob. "Good," he whispered, "you can move." For the first time since the war began, he allowed himself to hope. Not because he had won, but because he had created. Because against every rule, every limit, every ounce of despair, something new had been born. He turned off the engine and stepped outside. The morning light broke through the clouds, pale and fragile. The valley was quiet. Smoke drifted in the distance, but for a moment the world felt still. Anton wiped his hands on his uniform and looked back at the workshop. Through the doorway, the outline of the machine stood against the light, rough, jagged and alive. He didn't know what the coming days would bring. He didn't know that within weeks, that same creation would roll into battle. For now, he only knew this: the impossible wasn't finished. It had just begun. Late April 1943, before sunrise. The frost on the workshop threshold had turned to a thin skin of glass, and Anton broke it with his boot as he stepped inside. The engine he and Emil had coaxed to life still held the night's warmth. He laid his palm on its casing as though greeting a patient who had made it through until morning. The air smelled of cold iron and diesel. Somewhere beyond the valley, the sky pulsed with distant flashes. A courier arrived with a paper that felt damp from the fog. The ink bled at the edges. Sector massing to pull back. He recited, eyes fixed on the words, not on Anton. If it can move, move it. If it can't, burn it. He looked up once, then down again, uncomfortable. Orders. Anton folded the paper and slid it into his breast pocket. He did not burn things that could still breathe. He tightened his scarf and walked the line of parts he'd laid out in an almost religious order. The truck engine rebuilt from cracked bearings and optimism. The final drive scrounged from a tractor's stubborn heart. The rough turret ring ground from a millstone of steel plate. Each piece had a history of smoke and failure. Each one had chosen to stay. By the time Emil came in, his cheeks red from the cold, Anton had already chalked a list on the wall: fuel lines, track tension, return rollers. He tapped the last words with the back of the chalk. "We can't afford a throne track when we finally leave this place." Emil nodded, tugging on stiff gloves. "They say the road west is already clogged. There is always room for something that keeps moving." Anton said, and went to work on the left idler, teeth clicking softly under his wrench. The camp was shedding weight, radios vanished, ammunition chests were hauled like coffins, men stripped canvas from tents and left the poles to stand like a broken forest. A chaplain hurried past, cradling a box of letters as though it were the only cargo that mattered. Inside the workshop, time thickened. The engine coughed, caught, and settled into a low rhythm that vibrated along the floorboards. Emil fed the throttle with careful fingers. Anton leaned into the engine bay, listening not only with his ears, but with memory to the pitch of a bearing just before it heated, the faint whine of imbalance that once cost a column a mile of road. At noon the commander finally came. He was taller than Anton remembered, or perhaps smaller. Nothing had a true proportion any more. His greatcoat carried the damp of the valley, and his eyes held the kind of redness that comes from maps watched too long. "You should be packing," he said without preface. "We move within 48 hours. Anton wiped his hands, left black prints on a rag that had long ago given up the idea of being clean. "I am packing," he said, and let the engine answer for him with its low, relentless thrum. The commander studied the welded plates, pitted, irregular, bolted in a pattern that would have made any quartermaster swear, and the ugly promise of the gun mount. He shook his head once. "And if it breaks a mile from here, then I will fix it a mile from here," Anton replied. "Or you will block the retreat, I won't." The commander stared another beat, then stepped back into the doorway. 48 hours, he said again, as though the words themselves might move metal, and left. When the footsteps faded, Emil pushed the throttle. The engine note deepened. Anton nodded at the right-hand track. Again, he said, and they both watched the chain run, links clacking across the drive sprocket. The tension was close, not perfect. Perfection had died months ago. They shut it down, and the silence returned heavier than before. Anton crouched beside the track. He ran his fingers along the pins, and felt the slack, the way a musician knows a string is off. He spoke without looking up. "We need leaf springs, 2 good ones." Emil frowned. "Where?" "Farmyard, 2 kilometers east. The blacksmith died in winter. His carts won't miss them." He straightened and pulled his coat on. "Get the hand cart." They moved through a fog that made the trees into spectres and the snow into ash. The farm stood in an elbow of the road, quiet as a secret. The door of the smithy hung from one hinge and creaked a single note in the wind. Inside, the forge was cold, but the smell of old fire clung to the walls. They found 2 leaf springs under a coat of dust, each heavy as a promise. Emil grunted as he lifted one end. "It feels like we're stealing from a grave." "We are," Anton said. "And the dead would rather we live." They trundled the weight home. Along the ditch, boots lay in a neat pair, soles toward the road, as if a man had stepped out of them and into the fog. No one spoke of it. Back in the depot, Anton cut and fitted the springs, his hands steady, his eyes flat with concentration. The metal rang true under the hammer. That sound, the square, honest sound, cheered him more than any speech from any officer ever had. "Again," he said, and they ran the tracks, the tension now true, the return rollers turning in obedient arcs. The machine did not move yet, but it had ceased to resist them. At dusk, a reconnaissance plane droned low, its single prop whining like a mosquito that had learned malice. Emil froze, looking up. Anton did not pause. He slid the canvas tarpaulin over the turret mount, and the thing in the depot became once more a pile of unsorted junk. The plane passed, circling once. They waited until the sound thinned and was gone. Emil exhaled slow. "They'll come. They always do." Anton said, tightening down the tarp's last eyelet, "That is their habit. Ours is to be ready." Night brought a new list. Fuel scavenged from abandoned trucks, cut with kerosene and prayer. A periscope improvised from mirror shards, set at forgiving angles. A throttle spring rewound from a watch coil. They ate standing, each bite a chore, and drank coffee that tasted of metal and ash. When sleep finally pulled Emil away, Anton remained, eyes on the chalk marks that now covered half the wall. Numbers. Angles, crude ratios. He thought of his father's hands guiding his own at a bench long ago. the slow, patient rhythm of patience itself. He spoke into the empty room. "The trick is not to be clever," he said. "The trick is to refuse despair." Morning found the valley louder. The road west rumbled with trucks forced to share space with men who had run out of fuel and were now pushing their own machines. A mule brayed at the idea of duty. A medic shouted for bandages that no one had. Anton took the prototype into the yard for the first real turn under weight. The treads bit the frozen earth. The hull lurched left, then corrected with a stubbornness that felt oddly like pride. Emil walked alongside, one hand on the side plate as though steadying a young animal. A dozen soldiers stopped to watch, laughter forming around their mouths without reaching their eyes. One called out, "Frankenstein," and another, "Kessler's coffin." No one wagered rations on it. Rations had become legend. Anton ignored them. He listened to the language of vibration. There a harshness at 30% throttle. Here a shiver through the hull where the couplings sent more truth than power. He eased the throttle down, the engine note smoothed like a comfort. He looked at Emil and nodded.